After killing one of Palestine's most famous and well-regarded journalists, Shireen Abu Akleh, Israeli forces have attacked mourners carrying her coffin. Her former employer, Al Jazeera, was broadcasting live as the body of their slain colleague was carried out of a hospital and towards a church for her funeral.
I've looked at news throughout the world for decades, and I've never seen a scene like this. Look at that. Attacking innocent people, carrying a casket. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say anymore. What are they expecting now? This is unbelievable. Unbelievable. Oh my God. Such disrespect for the dead and for those who are mourning the dead. How is that a security threat to anyone? How is that disorderly? Why does that require this kind of repression, this kind of violence on the part of Israelis?
That's right. Israeli forces killed one of the Arab world's most famous journalists, and then they attacked her funeral while her employer streamed the images across the world. Have you ever seen a clearer image of a country that doesn't care how people see it? I can't think of a clearer physical manifestation of state impunity. They just don't care. We have one more film of that particular moment, which shows the events in some more detail. Literally, police using their batons to hit people as they're carrying a coffin. I've never seen anything like that in my life. People carrying a coffin of one of the world's most well-renowned journalists, one of the most well-renowned journalists of the Arab world, and then you've got an occupying force hitting people with batons who are carrying, presumably this is the people carrying her coffin will be her friends, her colleagues, and they're getting hit with batons while they're carrying their friend on their shoulders. Now, I think you could also hear their flashbangs or stun grenades, which presumably were thrown by the police. So they were not holding back. This was people trying to take the coffin from a hospital to her funeral. It's mind-blowing. We've got a bit more context here. So Lina Al-Safin, who is a producer at Al Jazeera, reported Israeli forces have given orders to arrest anyone who raises the Palestine flag during Shireen Abu Akleh's funeral in Jerusalem. So anyone who raises the flag. Right. And obviously she was very famous as a journalist covering Palestinian issues, and she was killed by an occupying force. You would want to be waving the Palestine flag, and even that is too much for them to tolerate after they kill a world-famous journalist. Of course, though, as you can see in footage of later in the day, Palestinians remained undeterred. Thousands of people amassed while Shireen Abu Akleh's coffin was carried through occupied East Jerusalem. As you can see, there are multiple Palestinian flags being flown.
I think this must be the most remarkable thing I've ever seen. I can't think of another moment recently where, when her coffin fell, I mean, instinctively, your hand goes over your mouth, doesn't you? Think, oh my God. And there is something that's universal amongst, there are many things which are universal among humans. One is generally a respect for the dead. Doesn't mean you have to like them or mourn for them, but generally speaking, attacking an unarmed group of people, holding aloft a coffin. I mean, I can't think of any other examples. There are recent examples in Ireland, but like that, I've not seen them. I'm sure other people can say, well, there are examples. I've never seen another example that brazen. There is a video which wasn't played here, which shows just brief moments before that started. There was no altercation. They were a peaceful crowd, and it was initiated by the Israeli forces. This has been repeatedly described by the BBC as clashes. BBC News on Twitter said that the coffin had been jostled. There was violence. And, to say there's clashes is like saying that, there was a clash between a bullet and John F. Kennedy's head in Dallas. There wasn't a clash. Somebody shot John F. Kennedy. You need to report it accurately. Armed forces attacked a peaceful group of mourners holding a coffin aloft. It fell out. I mean, her body could have fallen out of the casket. And this is incidental, but she was a Christian. This is important to say, Michael. This woman who's died is a Christian. Many Christians in Palestine. Of course, it doesn't matter what her faith is, but to see a coffin, a casket, and it had Christ on the top, and for religious leaders in this country, the Archbishop of Canterbury has not said anything. Right? This is the Holy Land. This is a Christian woman in the Holy Land. As her death is being mourned by people, they're being attacked by, well-equipped, effectively a paramilitary force. And not a peep from our political leaders. Boris Johnson will happily say, we are a Christian country. Well, okay. Normally, you'd probably want to make this a point to perhaps highlight. I find it remarkable. The hypocrisy is just astonishing. But the ancillary story as well for me is just the media coverage. I find it extraordinary, Michael. Think about this for a second. I don't think any other country on earth will behave like this. And that's not to say there aren't countries worse than Israel. You might say, oh, God knows what, North Korea. I don't think that, by the way. But with a bunch of indices, you could say some countries are worse than others, fine. But I honestly can't think of any country that would do this so brazenly. Russia. Yes, we know, for instance, that the Kremlin has taken out journalists. But the idea that it attacks the people mourning the dead journalist as they're holding their coffin. By the way, her family as well, when they were mourning, Israeli forces go there as well, and they shot her in the face. This is one of the leading journalists in the Arab world, and like you say, it speaks of impunity. And today there are a couple of politicians calling it out, and they're saying this is terrible. It can't be allowed to happen. It's happening because of people like you who give the confidence to the Israeli state that they know they can do things like this without any consequences of any meaning whatsoever. And it's not even a question of we don't condemn this stuff. We tacitly support it, Michael. We give the state of Israel political support. There is political consensus across the spectrum, Labour to Tory, about the fact that BDS, oh my God, boycott, divestment, sanctions, unethical, unacceptable. We're shooting a journalist in the face and almost toppling her casket in open air and intimidating her family as they mourn her. That's acceptable. The grim truth is, might makes right for these people. I don't think any normal person thinks this is a reasonable way to carry on. And it is unique. And it's unique because they have the tacit support of Britain, Europe, and the United States. And anybody in these countries who tries to elevate political consciousness around this issue in a meaningful way, 9 times out of 10, is singled out for attack, often slandered. If you say this is an awful thing to happen, people say, well, that's anti-Semitic. What an utterly crazed, absurd, disgusting thing to say. Now we know how evil happens, right? If nobody's celebrating them doing this, they just say, well, we don't know the full story. You have to have the context. Remarkable. And look, some of that, okay, we're not in charge of that. We're not in control of that. But we are in control of how our national broadcaster covers this. Disgusting, saying it's a clash. It's like saying somebody tries to knock you out with an iron pole, saying, my head clashed with the iron pole. As if, it's equally to blame. It's a parody of poor journalism and even poorer ethics.
They're almost kind of like gaslighting Al Jazeera's staff. They're a big professional organization with very well-trained journalists. There were journalists at the scene. Normally, if you've got journalists who witness something with their eyes, you take that. There were more than one Al Jazeera journalist who witnessed the killing with their eyes, right? And they said, this was Israeli forces killing our colleague. And then all the rest of the world, they're just like, oh, Al Jazeera says this might have happened. 2 professionally trained journalists said this happened, and no one other than the military of a foreign country who should never be trusted by a journalistic organization, they're being given equal weight. And I think you saw it again there. So in that clip, you've got the hosts on Al Jazeera saying they've never seen anything like this. This is their colleague, right? Their colleague is in a coffin, and while her coffin is being carried, the riot police of another country are literally beating the people who are holding the coffin up. They're saying, I've never seen anything like this before in my life. The BBC, there were some clashes at a funeral. Do you not have any respect for your colleagues? Doing this at anyone's funeral would be appalling, but it is worth noting This is a really, really famous journalist, right? It's sort of like if John Simpson or Lise Doucette was killed in Russia by a sniper, Russia deny it. And I was trying to think, well, what would be the analogy? Would they then attack the funeral? But it wouldn't work, because for them to attack the funeral, they'd have to be occupying Britain, and we don't live under occupation. That's why it's so hard to find an analogy, because this only makes sense when you consider that these are people who live under occupation, and their occupiers act with total impunity. And for some reason, the rest of the world is happy to just look on and make excuses for it, say, oh, we're not quite sure what happened. There was a funeral, there were some clashes, there was a bullet, there was a face, they met, and someone died. And this is one of their colleagues. This is a journalist. What solidarity is there when people won't report truthfully, when not just, and I don't want to say not just any old colleague, because anyone getting killed violently is appalling. Any journalist getting killed violently is appalling. But this is one of the leading journalists in the world who has been killed in cold blood, and no one in the Western media is allowed to call a spade a spade.
It's only last year that you had the offices of Al Jazeera and Associated Press. AP, Michael, this is one of the most credible, legitimate names in global media. Their offices were destroyed. They were bombed by Israeli forces. In the space of 2 years, you have that, where you have the Associated Press and Al Jazeera seeing their offices destroyed, and now you're seeing their staff members shot at, one fatally. There's no other country in the world that behaves like this. And we repeatedly hear about press freedom and journalists in danger. And of course, they mean, people operating in Iran or in Russia and China. Why aren't they talking about Israel? There's a serious, sustained problem with regards to media freedoms. You can't talk about a free press, Michael, if you're literally murdering journalists doing their job. And the instinct of the Israeli authorities was to say that it wasn't us, it was the Palestinians, which makes it even worse, by the way, because at least you could say, well, if they immediately announced, there'll be an investigation, this shouldn't have happened, this was an errant sniper, completely unauthorized, obviously disgusting and unacceptable, but you could say, well, look, the state authorities at least care about how they look, right? The Israelis don't care how they look, Michael. Civil society, in an organized way, tries to make there be any kind of consequences for their inhumanity and monstrous behavior. Well, those people are marginalized. Whether they're protesters, whether they're in business, or whether they're politicians. People need to grow a backbone and actually stand by their commitments for the rule of law and human rights and basic dignity, and not be cowed on this stuff. And I hope they're not. I hope the experience in Europe over the last 5 years, particularly around Jeremy Corbyn, I really hope that instills in people a sense of personal strength and standing by your values. What is happening in Israel is unacceptable. In 50, 60 years' time, people look back on that as utterly barbarous. They will look at it as we look at things from the 19th century. They will say, how the hell did that happen in 2022? I fully believe that. It is such an outlier and an anomaly, precisely because Israel claims to be this great democracy. Democracies, of course, don't behave like that. Of course they don't. They don't shoot journalists in the face. Will there be political consequences? Well, certainly not in this country. We had people from the Israeli Labour Party, Michael, monitoring our own local elections with the Labour Party. The Israeli Labour Party was determining whether we were having free and fair elections, and whether the British Labour Party is no longer racist. We're living in upside down land. So I don't expect any credible, serious input from Labour politicians, certainly not from Tory ones either. But civil society and protest has to keep going, because it's so awful.